Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of revenge, secrecy, and an unsettling festive theme. This is the story of the Naughty List murders. A tale of grudges, cryptic clues, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, how far would someone go to settle old scores? And how does one small-town killer remain a step ahead? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and chilling story of the Naughty List murders. In a small town where everyone knows your name, a series of murders sends shockwaves through the community. The killer isn't targeting anyone at random, only those with dark pasts, the ones everyone secretly despises. But with each chilling murder, the killer leaves behind a strange calling card, a piece of coal engraved with the words Naughty List. Who is behind these twisted acts of vengeance, and why are they choosing to punish only the worst of the worst? The answers lie in the past, and they may be closer than anyone ever imagined. The small town of Cedar Grove had always been a peaceful place. With its cobblestone streets, cozy houses adorned with Christmas lights, and the scent of pine wafting through the air, it seemed like the perfect community, prided itself on its tight-knit community and picturesque charm. But that serenity was shattered one cold December morning when Marla Dunn, the local shopkeeper, was found dead in her home. Marla had built her life around her small, cluttered store, known for selling everything from vintage ornaments to handmade knickknacks. Yet, despite her role in the town's economy, Marla was widely disliked. She had a sharp tongue and a quick temper, often making enemies with her cutting remarks and refusal to compromise. Her customers avoided her, and the townsfolk whispered about her disdain for the very people who supported her business. When Marla's body was discovered, it was clear this wasn't just an accident. She had been stabbed once deeply in the chest. The blood stain around her body was stark against the cold tile floor. But it wasn't just the murder that was disturbing, it was what had been left behind. Next to her body was a small, almost unnoticeable piece of coal. On it were the words Naughty List, crudely carved into the surface. Detective Claire Bennett, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, arrived at the scene, her boots crunching the snow beneath her as she entered the house. The room was freezing, and the thick smell of death hung heavy in the air. Claire had seen her fair share of crime scenes, but something about this one felt different, personal, even. The coal, the message, it wasn't just about killing. It was a statement. Claire was methodical in her approach, taking in every detail. She noticed the store was locked up tight, with no signs of forced entry. Marla's life had been routine. She had no known enemies outside of her reputation. But the clue, the piece of coal, suggested this wasn't a random act. Whoever had done this had planned it, and the message was deliberate. The killer was sending a clear signal. The detective began asking around town, but the people were tight-lipped. Everyone knew Marla wasn't a kind soul, and many believed she had made her fair share of enemies. There was no shortage of suspects, neighbors who had clashed with her over petty disputes, former employees who had left after falling out with her, even a few disgruntled customers. Cedar Grove had never been a place for deep friendships, and Marla was at the center of many unresolved grudges. As Claire sifted through Marla's life, she found the same recurring pattern, a woman who had earned the disdain of nearly everyone around her. She had burned bridges over the years, pushing people away with her bitterness. But the town had always found a way to tolerate her. Until now. The discovery of the coal and the words Naughty List began to stir unease. Who would target someone so disliked? It seemed almost like an act of vengeance, but vengeance for what? As Claire delved deeper into Marla's history, the question hung heavy in her mind. Was this murder just about one person, or was it part of something larger? The mystery was only just beginning, and already the answers seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The quiet of Cedar Grove had been irrevocably broken, and with that first murder, the town's dark secrets began to surface, one by one. The chilling murder of Marla Dunn rocked Cedar Grove, but the town's unease quickly morphed into full-blown panic when another body was discovered. This time, the victim was Robert Hayes, a local landlord known for his ruthless evictions during the harshest winters and greed. His death came in the same eerie fashion as Marla's, a single stab wound. His body was found sprawled in his office, a bloody trail leading to the desk where another coal piece sat deep and precise, along with the same haunting words naughty list carved into it. Robert's reputation in town had been nothing short of vile. He had evicted tenants in the dead of winter without regard for their circumstances, often throwing families onto the streets without warning. Whispers about him were as bitter as the cold winds that swept through the town during the winters he'd caused so much suffering. The town's resentment toward him was palpable, making him another prime target for a killer who seemed to be choosing victims based on their unlikability. Detective Claire Bennett stood at the scene of Robert's murder, her breath misting in the frigid air. She had been hoping that Marla's death would be an isolated incident, a crime of passion, or something more personal. But this felt like something far more calculated. It wasn't just about killing, it was about sending a message. Marla and Robert were two sides of the same coin, both people who had alienated those around them through years of greed, cruelty, and selfishness. Could it be that their deaths were connected? As Claire investigated Robert's life, she uncovered a tangled web of enemies. Tenants who had fought bitterly with him over unfair leases, former business partners who had been left penniless by his scheming, and disgruntled workers who had been treated like disposable tools. Much like Marla, Robert's downfall wasn't a mystery, it was written in the resentment of everyone he had ever wronged. Yet, despite this long list of suspects, Claire found herself increasingly frustrated. The more she dug into Robert's past, the more she realized that nearly everyone in town had a reason to hate him. But none of them had the motive to kill in such a methodical way. This killer wasn't just punishing these people for their sins, they were making a statement. But what did that statement mean? The killer wasn't finished. Claire combed through her suspect list, but with so many townsfolk harboring grudges against the victims, narrowing it down seemed impossible. The case grew colder with each passing day, while the killer remained eerily silent. Not long after Robert's death, Claire received another call. This one from the local police station. Another body had been found. This time, the victim was Evelyn Price, a former teacher who had been disgraced and forced to leave the school system after an affair with a student. She had always been a figure of scorn in Cedar Grove, her fall from grace leaving her a shadow of the person she had once been. Evelyn's body was found in her dilapidated home, the same method of murder and the same telling clue left behind. Another piece of coal, another naughty list. As Claire stood over the body, she couldn't help but wonder if the town's dark history of grudges and betrayals was coming back to haunt them in the most horrific way possible. Her growing suspicion became harder to ignore. These murders weren't just random acts of violence, they were part of a twisted plan, an execution of some kind of personal justice. But who was orchestrating this? Who had the patience and the deep-seated hatred to hunt down these individuals one by one? And what could their motive possibly be? The discovery of Evelyn Price's body marked a turning point in the investigation. As the third victim in a string of brutal murders, Evelyn's death confirmed that the killer wasn't simply choosing random targets. Each victim had something in common, something that tied them together in the killer's mind. But what was it? The repeating pattern of the coal calling card and the cryptic naughty list left Claire Bennett with more questions than answers. She now realized that this was no ordinary spree. This was a calculated act of revenge, and the killer was methodically erasing people from the town's dark past. The investigation took a darker turn as Claire connected the victims' histories. Marla, Robert, and Evelyn all had one thing in common beyond their actions: they were all tied to a hidden past, a secret club from their youth, a group known as the Naughty Watch, that had once aimed to expose those who had bullied or tormented others in their community. The club, founded decades earlier, had been composed of local children who had once decided to take justice into their own hands. They sought to expose and punish those who had bullied or mistreated others in the community. It had been a small, secret group, but it had caused a stir back in the day, earning both praise and disdain from the adults who had watched it grow. But this was no longer about righting wrongs. It had turned into something far more sinister, and Claire realized that the killer wasn't just punishing the wicked, they were drawing from a much older, darker grudge. Claire began speaking with the few remaining members of the Naughty Watch, hoping to uncover a connection that would lead her to the killer. Some of them were still around, though most had long since left Cedar Grove. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon a curious pattern. All three victims, Marla, Robert, and Evelyn, had once been targets of the club. They had been the bullies, the ones whom the group had tried to expose for their cruel behavior. As children, they had been the ones who made life miserable for others, using their power to intimidate and hurt those around them. In the years that followed, they had become figures of scorn, widely disliked and ostracized by the community. It seemed that the killer wasn't just picking victims randomly, they were going after people who had once made others' lives a living hell. The more Claire dug into the past, the more she understood the killer's twisted logic. This wasn't just a revenge spree, it was a crusade. Whoever was behind these murders had suffered deeply at the hands of the club's targets. The coal, the naughty list message, it was all a way of righting the wrongs of the past, punishing those who had once caused so much pain. The deeper Claire got into the case, the more she became convinced that the killer wasn't working alone. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Though the murders had seemed like isolated events at first, there was something about them that felt coordinated. The timing of the deaths, the method of killing, and the calling card targeted all pointed to one thing: a carefully planned vendetta, orchestrated by someone who had been wronged by those they sought to punish. But who had the resources, the patience, and the deep-seated anger to pull it off? It all seemed too precise to be the work of a single person acting on impulse. Claire began to consider the possibility of more than one person being involved, but who could it be? And why were they taking so long to strike again? The victims were now dead, but the investigation was far from over. The killer was still out there, their twisted sense of justice far from complete. And Claire knew that the next step in her investigation would be the most dangerous one yet. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't lead to any comforting answers. Instead, they led her down a dark and winding path that only seemed to get murkier with each passing day. As Claire prepared to take the next step, she felt the growing weight of the case pressing on her shoulders. She was getting closer, but the killer's identity remained a mystery. Would she be able to uncover the truth before the body count rose again? The clock was ticking, and Cedar Grove's deadly past was coming back to haunt them all. Then came the breakthrough. All three victims had been part of the group, except they hadn't been members. They were the original bullies the club had targeted. Cedar Grove had become a town on edge, its past creeping into the present in the most deadly way possible. And Claire was no closer to finding the killer than when she started. The investigation into the murders of Marla, Robert, and Evelyn had taken a dark turn, and Detective Claire Bennett found herself caught in a web of old wounds, long-held grudges, and hidden connections. With the naughty list killer's twisted crusade targeting the worst of Cedar Grove's past, Claire knew she had to act fast. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth seemed just out of reach, slipping through her fingers with every lead she pursued. Her suspicion began to fall on Marcus Reed, a man who had returned to Cedar Grove after years of absence. Marcus had been a former victim of the naughty watch as a child, a quiet boy who had been relentlessly tormented by the members of the group. His life had been shattered by the cruelty of the people who had once been his peers, and he had left town as soon as he could, only to return now under mysterious circumstances. The more Claire learned about Marcus, the more she wondered if he had returned to finish what the club had started, but from the other side. Marcus seemed to have kept a low profile since his return, avoiding the spotlight and living a quiet life. He didn't have the obvious motives of others, he wasn't known for being violent, and there was no clear indication that he had any desire for revenge. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something about him didn't add up. When she looked closer at his past, she found that the story he'd told about his life in Cedar Grove was full of holes. He had been deeply scarred by the abuse he'd suffered as a child, but the idea that he'd come back to settle the score with those who had tormented him seemed plausible. Yet there was something about his calm demeanor that didn't quite fit with the cold brutality of the murders. The breakthrough came when Claire discovered that Marcus had been at the scene of Robert Hayes' murder, just hours before the body was discovered. His alibi didn't hold up, and there was no reasonable explanation for his presence at the crime scene. It was clear that Marcus had more to hide than he had let on. Could he be the one orchestrating the killings, or was he merely a pawn in someone else's twisted game? Claire's investigation had begun to feel like a race against time. The killer was growing bolder, leaving behind fewer clues but still managing to elude capture. Marcus's involvement seemed more likely by the day, but Claire couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone else was pulling the strings. As she dug deeper into his life, she uncovered a surprising revelation. Marcus hadn't been working alone. He had discovered the true identity of the killer, their final piece of the puzzle. Marcus became Claire's prime suspect, but without hard evidence, she couldn't act. Meanwhile, the town braced itself for another attack, knowing the killer wasn't finished yet. Days passed without incident, lulling the town into a false sense of security until Claire received an anonymous tip about a suspicious figure near the old church. Rushing to the location, she found Marcus standing over the body of his former tormentor, Anthony Mills. In his trembling hands was the killer's signature piece of coal. It seemed like an open and shut case, but as Claire interrogated Marcus, inconsistencies in his story emerged. His alibi for the first 2 murders checked out. Marcus wasn't the killer, but he had unwittingly stumbled onto the truth. He discovered the real one. His estranged sister, Grace Reed, was the real murderer. The air in Cedar Grove had grown thick with tension. Detective Claire Bennett knew the truth now, and it was worse than she had imagined. Grace Reed, Marcus's estranged sister, was the one behind the murders. Grace had been just as much a victim of the naughty watch as Marcus, but instead of fading into the background, she had spent years plotting her revenge. She had watched the town move on while she stewed in her anger, nursing a wound that never healed. Over the years, she had become consumed by the desire to make the people who had tormented her and her brother pay. She had meticulously planned each murder, carefully choosing her victims from the list of people who had once bullied her family. But Grace wasn't just punishing them, she was setting up Marcus, framing him for the killings that were part of her twisted vendetta. As Claire pieced the final clues together, she knew she had to act fast. Grace had one final target in mind, Marcus himself. With each passing day, the tension in Cedar Grove mounted, and Claire could feel the pressure building. Grace's twisted plan would come to its devastating conclusion, and Marcus would be the one to take the fall for the murders that had ravaged their town. The town's deadly past had come to a head, and the final confrontation was just around the corner. Claire realized Grace had been meticulous. She had taken the time to study her victims' lives, choosing people who had wronged her family and giving them the most brutal end. But Grace had been smart. She had hidden herself so well that even Claire had been fooled. The calling card, the coal, had been her way of marking her victims, a signature of her own twisted sense of justice. It was a message, a reminder of the wrongs done to her and her brother all those years ago. But where was Grace now? And could Claire stop her before it was too late? The clock was ticking, and the final chapter was yet to be written. Claire's instincts kicked into high gear. She had to find Grace before she found Marcus. The town, still reeling from the shock of the murders, was on edge. People had already begun to suspect Marcus, and if Grace's final act succeeded, the blame would fall on him, the quiet man who had returned to the town seeking peace. She couldn't let that happen. Claire's search led her to the edge of town, an old abandoned cabin that had been a place for runaways and outcasts. It was here, she suspected, that Grace had gone to ground. The place had been vacant for years, hidden from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. But Claire knew that Grace would be hiding there, waiting for the right moment to strike. She arrived at the cabin just as night was falling, the shadows growing longer, swallowing the landscape in darkness. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots as she approached the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. Claire was prepared for anything now, but she had to move carefully. Grace was clever, and she knew the town's every secret. It wouldn't be easy to catch her, not when she had been planning for so long. The door to the cabin creaked as Claire pushed it open, stepping into the cold, musty interior. There was a faint smell of old wood and dust, the air heavy with the weight of years of abandonment. As Claire moved further into the cabin, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She wasn't alone. Grace was there, her figure emerging from the shadows. Her eyes glinted with a cold, calculating fury, and her expression twisted into a grim smile as she stepped toward Claire. The last of her plan was in motion, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially not Claire, stop her now. With no words exchanged, the tension between them was palpable. Claire had a split second to act, her training kicking in as she moved toward Grace. It was a race against time now, the final confrontation that would determine the future of Cedar Grove. Claire's hands were steady as she reached for her gun, her mind focused on the task at hand. But Grace wasn't backing down. She was desperate, cornered, and willing to do anything to ensure that her twisted vision of justice was carried out. The room erupted in chaos as Claire lunged forward, but before she could reach Grace, the sound of a gunshot rang out, deafening in the silence of the cabin. Claire's heart stopped for a moment as she processed what had just happened. Had she been too late? Had Grace succeeded in killing Marcus, or worse herself? The echo of the gunshot hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed frozen. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat. But as she reached the spot where Grace had stood, she found nothing. No body. No sign of struggle. Only the quiet hum of the wind outside. The cabin was empty, save for a single piece of coal lying on the floor. Claire bent down, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. The message was unmistakable: "See you next Christmas." A chill ran down her spine as she realized what this meant. Grace had vanished, slipping away into the night like a shadow, leaving behind nothing but her final, cryptic warning. The killer was still out there, watching, waiting, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Grace had been a part of something much bigger, a force driven by revenge that wouldn't be satisfied so easily. She had left Cedar Grove, but the darkness she had unleashed was far from finished. As Claire stood in the empty cabin, the weight of the past few days crashed down on her. The murders, the twists, the lies, everything had led to this chilling moment. But the story wasn't complete. The killer wasn't caught. The town wasn't safe. With the piece of coal in her hand and the haunting message burned into her mind, Claire knew that she had only uncovered part of the truth. Grace would return. The cycle of vengeance would continue, and Cedar Grove would never be the same. The investigation wasn't over. It had just begun, and Claire's fight for justice was far from finished. As the snow began to fall again, Claire looked out into the darkness, knowing that this quiet town, for all its peace, was hiding a far more sinister truth, a truth that would reveal itself when the time was right. But for now, all she could do was wait. See you next Christmas. The Naughty List murders left Cedar Grove, forever changed a town haunted by its past, and the knowledge that their killer was still out there. Was this truly about justice, or was it a descent into darkness that no one could escape? Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Cedar Grove's darkest chapters. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Mystery Minds for more gripping tales from the shadowy corners of the human psyche. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.